Finding the car, which is how we
She's on her way. Yeah, looking to bring those signs back.
Yeah, we're just on this side. Come with us. She's looking on this side, which is a better idea.
Palestine will be free! Palestine will be free! From the river to the sea! From the river to the sea! Palestine will be free! Palestine will be free! بالدم يفديك يا فلسطين! بالروح بالدم يفديك يا فلسطين! بالروح بالدم يفديك يا فلسطين! بالروح بالدم يفديك يا فلسطين! Hear what you say and we follow all the way! We don't care follow! We don't care what you say and follow all the way!
The Arab-Israeli conflict is presented in the media as a territorial dispute. A common argument asserts that in the territory of the present state of Israel, there used to reside a 1,000-year-old Arab Palestinian people, which was forcibly evicted by the Zionist Jews. In order to evaluate these claims, we must examine the historical facts. We shall do this in what follows. HIR and Faces present a series based on the book The Collapse of the West, the Next Holocaust and Its Consequences. It was the Romans who, in the 2nd century of the Common Era, first used the name Syria Palestina for Jerusalem and surrounding areas. It was an incorrect usage. In Greek, Palestina means homeland of the Philistines, but the Philistines never occupied more than a tiny sliver on the eastern Mediterranean coast, including part of what is today's Gaza Strip, and they had ceased to exist centuries earlier. The Romans had conquered a place called Kingdom of Judah, and they themselves, after possessing it, called it Province of Judea. Both names mean homeland of the Jews. Why then did the Romans change the name to Syria Palestina? This is an important question. Jewish community and religion are organized around the law of Moses, which, according to Exodus, was born in an Egyptian slave revolt. This explains why the law of Moses denounces oppression and protects the poor. It also explains the preoccupations of the Roman military aristocracy. In those days, the Jews were a very large population distributed throughout the Mediterranean. The greatest worry of the Romans was that the popularity of the law of Moses among the oppressed peoples of the empire might result in revolution. In order to avoid such an outcome, the empire launched enormous mass killings of Jews, remembered today as the First Jewish War, the Diaspora Revolt, and the Second Jewish War. According to historians, taken together and in proportional terms, the Romans killed perhaps more Jews than did Adolf Hitler. Once the genocide had been concluded, Emperor Hadrian, after destroying Jerusalem in the 2nd century, brought Greeks to settle it and forbade the entrance to Jews under pain of death. The city was renamed Aelia Capitolina, and the area Syria Palestina. In political terms, Palestine means, there are no Jews here, nor do we allow them. Some Jews stubbornly remained in their Holy Land, and many others soon returned. The Romans informally continued to call the place Judea. With the passing of the centuries, the name Palestine was used less and less, and ceased to have a clear referent. Under the Turkish Ottoman Empire, overlord of the area from the 16th century, there was no administrative or political entity called Palestine. In the 20th century, after wrenching the Middle East from the Turks in World War I, the British revived the name when they created the British Mandate for Palestine. But their final definition of Palestine in 1922 was just 1/4 of the landmass that they themselves had baptized Palestine 2 years before. Such arbitrariness supports the complaint of Arab historian Philip Hitti, who testified in 1946 before the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry that there is no such thing as Palestine in history. Absolutely not. But if the name Palestine is an artificial creation of the Roman Empire, and later of the British Empire, then who are the so-called Palestinians? That question was answered by Zahir Muhsin, the chief of military operations of the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, now better known as the Palestinian Authority. In an interview with Dutch magazine Trouw, Muhsin explained, "We are all part of one people, the Arab nation. We are one people. Just for political reasons, we carefully underwrite our Palestinian identity. Because it is of national interest for the Arabs to advocate the existence of Palestinians to balance Zionism. Yes, the existence of a separate Palestinian identity exists only for tactical reasons. The establishment of a Palestinian state is a new tool to continue the fight against Israel and for Arab unity." Why does Muhsin say, a new tool to continue the fight against Israel? In war after war, the combined efforts of several Arab Muslim states were defeated by tiny Israel, again and again. So a new tool was needed, a political warfare strategy that combined terrorism with diplomacy to achieve what open warfare could not. But is Zahir Muhsin saying that a Palestinian people with a presumed right to the land of the Jewish state was simply invented? The PLO charters appear to confirm this. In its first charter, dated 1964, the PLO defined Palestine in Article 2 with its boundaries at the time of the British Mandate. This is a reference to the second arbitrary definition of the British from 1922. How can a 20th century foreign colonial power arbitrarily define the boundaries of the supposedly ancestral land of the Palestinians? But in truth, the PLO did not even really adopt the British definition. In Article 24, the PLO explicitly asserted that Judea, Samaria, and Gaza the territories which it now claims for its desired state were not Palestinian. Article 24. This organization does not exercise any territorial sovereignty over the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan or on the Gaza Strip. In 1968, the PLO rewrote its charter. This time, the definition of Palestine did not exclude Gaza, Judea, and Samaria, so the PLO was now claiming these territories. What explains the change? In 1964, when the PLO wrote its first charter, Egypt was illegally occupying Gaza, and Jordan was illegally occupying Judea and Samaria. But then the Arab states provoked the War of 1967, or Six-Day War, in which the Israelis captured the territories of Gaza, Judea, and Samaria, among others. It was after this that the PLO rewrote its constitution in 1968, this time including Gaza, Judea, and Samaria in its definition of Palestine. The borders of Palestine are therefore flexible and are redrawn to surround exactly the territory which Israel controls. In other words, the borders of Palestine are chosen merely so that it can be used as a tool to continue the fight against Israel. But if Palestine is a recent invention, and the same goes for the Palestinian identity, then where do the Arab Muslims now calling themselves Palestinian come from? Today, about 8 million people live in Israel. But the most reliable estimate about the 19th century puts the population of this area at 300,000. It was practically empty. And that is how 19th century travelers described it. For example, in the mid-19th century, the British consul complained that the area was empty of inhabitants. When Mark Twain visited, he remarked that in the Jezreel Valley there wasn't a single village to be found for 30 miles all around. And a visiting French author, Pierre Loti, wrote that cities and palaces had turned to dust. In a historical study, Karl Hermann Voss explained all this as a result of the Arab-Muslim conquest. In the 12.5 centuries between the Arab conquest in the 7th century and the beginnings of the Jewish return in the 1880s, Palestine was laid waste. Its ancient canal and irrigation systems were destroyed, and the wondrous fertility of which the Bible spoke vanished into desert and desolation. Under the Ottoman Empire of the Turks, the policy of desfoliation continued. The hillsides were denuded of trees and the valleys robbed of their topsoil. And the few people who lived there, who were they? A majority were Muslim, but they were divided by various identities, some of them violently opposed to each other, and none of them Palestinian. There were also small Jewish communities in the large settlements and in the villages of Galilee, and also large populations in Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias. In Jerusalem, in fact, the Jews were a majority. A document from the British consulate dated 1859 states, "The Muslims of Jerusalem do not exceed a fourth of the entire population." In 1878, 2 years before the Zionist migrations began, the Ottoman Sultan launched a resettlement policy to bring foreign Muslims, mainly Circassians and Algerians. Historian Arnold Blumberg explains, after 1880, the forces of nascent Jewish nationalism, foreign Muslim colonization, sponsored by the Turks, and spontaneous Arab immigration prompted by the new prosperity of Palestine changed the demographic face of the land. Given that starting in 1878, enormous waves of Muslim immigration began arriving in what was essentially an empty territory, it is obvious that the vast majority of those now calling themselves Palestinian do not have thousand-year-old roots in the place. This is confirmed by the UN's behavior, for it has defined a Palestinian refugee as any non-Jew who left during the War of 1948 and whose family had been residing in the area even just 2 years before then. Without such a definition, the population of so-called Palestinian refugees would dwindle almost to nothing. Now then, everybody recognizes that the Zionist Jews settled mostly on barren lands that nobody was using. The very King Abdullah of Transjordan, who would participate in the effort to destroy the nascent Jewish state in 1948, wrote in 1946, I was astonished at what I saw of the Jewish settlements. They have colonized the sand dunes, drawn water from them, and transformed them into a paradise. The Jewish recovery of the land produced an economic explosion that attracted many Arabs from neighboring countries looking for a better life, and they fattened the numbers of those who would later call themselves Palestinians. Many believe, however, that the Zionist Jews stole the lands upon which they settled, using force. Did they? That question was answered by Haj Amin al-Husseini, the father of the Palestinian movement. In 1936, Husseini, Mufti of Jerusalem, launched his fourth great terrorist assault against the Jews of British Mandate Palestine. He called it the Arab Revolt. This violence lasted until 1939. In 1937, the British government sent a team to investigate, headed by Lord Peel. His mission was to establish what was happening and why. He called Husseini as witness. Sir Laurie Hammond asked Husseini whether the problem was that Jews had taken Arab lands by force. Husseini replied, "In most cases, the lands were acquired. I mean forcibly acquired. Compulsory acquisition, as land would be acquired for public purposes." No, it wasn't. Not taken by compulsory acquisition? No. But these lands amounting to some 700,000 dunams were actually sold? Yes, they were sold, but the country was placed in such conditions as would facilitate such purchases. I don't quite understand what you mean by that. They were sold. Who sold them? Landowners. Arabs? In most cases, they were Arabs. Was any compulsion put on them to sell? If so, by whom? As in other countries, there are people who by force of circumstances, economic forces, sell their land. The Arab landowners who, according to Husseini, had been forced to sell their lands were the Effendi, the great feudal lords of the area. They did whatever they liked. Nobody forced them to sell. And they had sold their least productive lands at very high prices. In fact, Husseini's own family, among the largest Effendi landowners, was doing a brisk business with these sales. The Husseinis first would threaten the small landowners with death if they dared commit the so-called national crime of selling land to Jews. Then they would buy these plots at fire sale prices, consolidate them, and resell them at extortionate prices to the Zionist Jews. Historian Nathan Weinstock explains, in other words, hyper-nationalist propaganda became a lucrative industry, indeed even an American-style racket, for the Arab gentry. To conclude, it is false to say that a 1,000-year-old Palestinian people had its ancestral land taken by force by the Zionist Jews. First, because there was no such Palestinian people in the land. And second, because the Zionist Jews bought their lands from willing Arab landowners at prices well above the usual market rate. To see the documentation that supports the statements in this video, visit The Collapse of the West, the Next Holocaust and Its Consequences, Part 1, Chapter 1. It is often said that Islam is the religion of peace, and that the Palestinian movement is secular. Are these claims true? That will be the topic of our next video.
יש פה התלהבות גדולה שבני אנחנו נמצאים פה בארמון המלך, בחצר הארמון. הגיעו בני המלך. אז יש פה צעקה, אדוני הוא האלוהים, אדוני הוא האלוהים. תעצור אותה. שלא ירימו לידיים. שלא ירימו לידיים. שלא ירימו לידיים. שתוק בו. שלא ירימו לידיים. שלא ירימו לידיים.
יהודה, די,
תעיש אותם, הם נוהגים באלימות ואתה לא עוצר באיזשהו. אז אני אעשו זוג, אז אל תגיד לי, אני אלך לבד. סובב, דבר אליהם, אני אלך לבד.
תלך למה יתחשב, אתה אין לך מה לעשות. ההתגרות שלך, יאללה, יהודה.
يلا خلص انصرف صدق كل الدنيا وراك يلا يلا كلب عوي هو يلا فلوس يلا ازعلك انت متدهور
למה אתם מקיפים משמאל?
אנחנו מקיפים משמאל כי יש לנו כלה שמתחתנת מחר, שבעזרת השם אנחנו מייחלים שמי ששיכן שמו בבית הזה הוא ימלא את ביתם באהבה ואחווה ושלום ורעות.
Hello again. A few people commenting here have picked up on the fact that I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East and also that I speak Hebrew. Surely that must mean at the very least that I'm a Jew and probably an agent of Shin Bet or the Mossad or, I don't know, the Rothschilds or something. Sorry, I'm not any of those things. After the Six-Day War in 1967, it became quite the thing for people from around the world, including Britain, to spend time on a kibbutz in Israel. It was an early version of the gap year, although it wasn't actually called that. I'm thinking some of the people that went, like Boris Johnson, Helen Mirren, they're not Jews either, and as far as I know they're not Zionist agents either. Anyway, some of the people stayed longer, they picked up Hebrew the way I did. It's just how things are. I want to look today at a misconception about Palestine, because the British in particular want to forget their role in the problems in the Middle East, and since they actually created the problems that led to Palestinian refugee camps and the Arab-Israeli wars, it's worth looking and see just what they did there. If you ask most people where Palestine is, they'll tell you it's occupies roughly the same land as Israel, and that a lot of the trouble starts because two peoples are trying to occupy that same limited area of land, and that's why there's struggles between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and people take sides on those terms depending often upon whether they're left-wing or right-wing or pro-America or they're Christians and so on. It's all a lot of nonsense. There's no struggle for any land, or at least there shouldn't be. Well, there wouldn't be if the British hadn't meddled in the area. Until the end of the First World War, there was no such country as Palestine. There never had been. It was simply an area of the Ottoman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean, and its borders were very vague. It was where we have modern-day Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. That was generally regarded as Palestine. After the end of the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire was being dismantled, the League of Nations decided to create some individual states, some individual countries in that area, and give European powers like France and Britain responsibility for looking after them. So one of those areas was going to be Palestine. The League of Nations created a new country called Palestine, and they drew its borders, and Britain agreed faithfully to look after the interests of the people of Palestine and take care of it and help guide it towards statehood. Here is Palestine after the First World War. Straight away, when looking at this map, something strikes us. And we look at this huge new country of Palestine. It's much bigger than the modern day state of Israel, about 5 times the size. Most of it's desert. There's plenty of room for as many Arabs and Jews as want to live there. There's no crush for space. No one needs to be stealing each other's land or anything. There's masses of room. So what happened to it all? Who stole 80% of Palestine? Look again at the map and see what you think. Did the Jews seize it? I mean, where did it go? It seems to have vanished. 80% of Palestine is missing. Who's got it? During the First World War, the British, with Lawrence of Arabia, I'm sure that we've heard of him, managed to enlist the aid of some Arabs to fight against the Ottomans, not because the British particularly cared about the nationalist Arab aspirations of the Arabs, but they were useful idiots, they were useful people to have on side. So we promised the Arabs all sorts of wonderful things, and Lawrence of Arabia helped blow up Turkish troop trains and all the rest of it. Okay, after the end of the war, some of those people, the Hashemites for example, were the custodians of the holy places in Mecca during the war, and for generations before. They ended up getting chased out of Mecca by the Wahhabis, the present day Saudi family. And so you had these groups of wandering Bedouin with their own armies, the armies that they'd used to fight the Ottomans, and they decided if they couldn't have Mecca and they couldn't have their own country there, they would carve out kingdoms in somewhere else in the Middle East, which was going to cause frightful trouble for the British. Just imagine. Okay, what happened? One of those groups, wandering Bedouin, I suppose I shouldn't really call them brigands, but that's what they were, army of brigands rampaging around the eastern Mediterranean, were led by a man called Abdullah. He was a Hashemite Bedouin. He was born in Mecca. Here he is. With their usual knack of turning their problems into triumphs, the British decided that rather than let Abdullah rage around and take whatever he wanted, they would set him up with his own country, and that way they would have an ally in the eastern Mediterranean, which would be very useful. So all they did was decide to give Abdullah 80% of Palestine. They just chopped it off, roughly where the River Jordan runs now, and right the way through the middle of the Negev, and they handed it over to Abdullah and said, there you go, it's a new country, we'll call it Transjordan because it's mostly to the east of the Jordan. And that's what happened to 80% of Palestine. The British gave it away to a man who had never been to Palestine in his life, was born in Mecca, had no connections whatsoever with the country. And that's how Transjordan was formed. Later on, of course, Abdullah grabbed another great chunk of Palestine, what some people call the West Bank, and some of us call Judea and Samaria. And then he declared himself king, and renamed his country Jordan. The Palestinians were furiously angry with Abdullah for this, and in the end he was assassinated in the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. You can still see where one of the bullets struck a pillar there. Anyway, the Hashemites were very unpopular with the Palestinians. No one liked seeing the whole chunk of their land stolen, but we'll go into that on another occasion. The next time that you hear about Palestine, remember you're not talking about the area of Israel, which you can see here. You're actually talking about the area here, which is Mandate Palestine. Had the British not stolen 80% of Palestine like this and given it to a wandering bunch of Bedouin bandits to whom they owed a favour, then there would probably be no Arab-Israeli wars, no Palestinian refugee camps, no trouble at all. There would have been room for everybody and a lot of trouble would have been avoided. I mean, those things are all legacies of Britain's imperial policy in that part of the world.
هل بتعرفوا انه تحت قبة الصخرة كان في من زمان معبد يهودي؟
لا.
بتعرفوا انه كان في معبد يهودي تحت قبة الصخرة من زمان؟
لا مش موجود هذا الشيء، أنا ما
No,
عمرنا
it
سمعنا
does not exist and we have never heard about it.
Did you know under Al-Aqsa Mosque, underneath there was the Jewish temple 2,000 years ago?
I don't believe that.
Okay, why don't you believe that?
Because there's no proof.
There's no proof.
There's no proof.
Okay, and what would be proof for you?
I don't know. Pass.
Do you know that under the Dome of the Rock, there used to be the Jewish temple?
هل عندك علم انه تحت قبة الصخرة كان في معبد يهودي؟ وكان في الهيكل؟ وكان في الهيكل؟ No?
No.
The temple? Oh, temple.
The temple.
The temple. Okay, he said no, I have no idea about these things. I don't have any idea about these things.
Had you ever heard it?
عمرك سمعت هالشيء عن الأخبار هون أو هون on the news here or there? No.
Did you know that under Dome of the Rock, there used to be a Jewish temple?
Well, they say, they claim, actually.
Okay.
But for many years they were searching for it, but they never found it. But we'll never know.
Okay, but do you understand what Jews believe it?
Yes.
Okay.
They claim it.
They claim.
There's no proof.
Okay, they say there's proof.
Yes.
Not an archaeologist, I don't know. They say there's proof and they want to pray there.
But for many years they were searching for it, but they never found it. So as a normal person, I would never know or go under the Dome of the Rock and know it. But they say at the end of the time, the Aqsa Mosque will fail, and they will never find it in our religion, actually. But
And they'll never find it?
yes, because
Why will
there's nothing under it.
Al-Aqsa Mosque fall?
Because it's weak. The search under it.
Oh, you're saying because they're doing archaeological
Yes.
digs underneath Al-Aqsa, it's going to fall?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm telling that you're scared of people being too close.
I am. Okay, does he know that under the Dome of the Rock, there was the Jewish temple?
تعرف إنه تحت قبة الصخرة كان في الهيكل يهودي؟
هذا الحكي ما في.
There is no basis of truth to this.
Has he heard this, first of all?
هل سمعت في هالشيء؟
اليهود بتحكي هيك.
The Jews. These are the Jews. What the Jews are saying.
Okay, and how does he know there's no truth?
طب كيف تعرف إنه غلط بالحكي هذا؟
هلا احنا بنعرف انه عبد الملك بن مروان هو اللي بنى المسجد الاقصى، وهذا الحكي من الاف السنين، وردت جدد بنايه المسجد الاقصى وبنت قبة الصخره على عهد اللي هو الوليد. يعني هذا الحكي من الاف
We know that from thousands of years ago, Abdul Malik bin Marwan is a king who built it and then it was rebuilt by his son Walid. So no, it's ours. تعرف إنه هل عندك علم أو هل عندك معرفة إنه المسجد الأقصى وقبة الصخرة مبنيين على المكان اللي كان مبني فيه المعبد اليهودي؟
هذا مرفوض السؤال.
This question is refused, is rejected.
Okay, why?
جملة وتفصيلا.
In every aspect, in every detail.
Why?
ليش؟
اليهود بيزعموا هذا الشيء.
نعم؟
اليهود بيزعموا هذا الشيء إنه الأقصى مبني على الهيكل تبعه.
That Al-Aqsa Mosque is built on their temple.
Okay, and how does he know it's not true?
كيف تعرف إنه هذا الشيء مش صحيح؟
حسب ديننا وحسب تاريخنا.
According to our religion and our history.
Okay, but Muhammad went to the furthest mosque How could there be a mosque there? Doesn't it say in the Isra that Muhammad went on a night journey to the furthest mosque? No?
هلا هو بيحكي انه حسب سورة الإسراء اللي في القرآن مكتوب انه سيدنا محمد راح على ابعد مسجد.
سيدنا محمد أسرى من مكة للأقصى، مش لأبعد مسجد، هو الأقصى.
The Prophet Muhammad
أسرى من مكة
traveled from Mecca to Al-Aqsa.
I know, but to a place that was the Jewish temple. That's what the Jews say.
اليهود بيحكوا انه الرسول عليه الصلاة والسلام أسرى من مكة للهيكل.
مش للهيكل، لثالث الحرمين الشريفين.
To the third most holiest mosque, which is Al-Aqsa.
Okay, not going to answer it. Okay.
هل تعرف انه اسفل قبة الصخرة من زمان كان في معبد يهودي؟
نعم، في هذا قبل 4000 سنة وشيء يعني.
مظبوط هذا الحكي؟ Yes, it's true. This is like 4,000 years ago.
بس أنا بعرف قبل 4000 سنة مش يهودي، اللي هم الرومان والأتراك وهيك.
But it's not a Jewish temple.
في معابد
It
بس
might have been
مش
Roman or Turkish or something.
برمموها يعني بزبطوها من أول وجديد.
تحت قبة الصخرة.
تحت قبة الصخرة ما بعرفش والله، أنا بعرف إنه مفحورة.
ما؟
مفحورة من تحت يعني أجوى.
I repeated and said under the dome of the rock. He said, I'm not sure, but I do know that underneath there's a lot of excavation. And I know that they, meaning the Jews, have some sort of temple, but I don't know where or.
Okay, if they think it's holy, is it okay if they pray there?
Where?
At the Sakura, at the Dome of the Rock.
At the Dome of the Rock?
Yeah.
If they the Jews.
They the Jews.
إذا اليهود بيعتبروا إنه قبة الصخرة مقدسة إلهم، هل مسموح يصلوا فيها؟
أنا في لهم منطقة للصلاة بس يعني صلاتنا غير صلاتهم غير يعني.
They have an area or location there by the walls to
At the
pray.
western wall,
At
yeah.
the western wall, but so they have their prayers and we have our prayers. Okay.
So under the Sahara, or the Dome of the Rock, under the Dome of the Rock, there was once a Jewish temple there, according to the Jews.
Okay.
What did they know that?
I'm going to say that the question is from outside.
إيه هو خليه يوقف هون عشان الناس ما يقطعوش بيناتهم.
Okay.
هلا السؤال اجانا من برا. نعم. السؤال بيحكي هل تعرفوا انه في مكان قبة الصخرة ومسجد الأقصى كان في كان مبني هيكل. كان مبني الهيكل. هل تعرفوا هذا الشيء؟ أو عندكم علم بهذا الشيء؟
طيب ماشي. بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. احنا هنا المسلمون الذين يعيشون في القدس يعتبرون القدس جزء لا يتجزأ من أرض فلسطين المباركة.
Muslims who live in Palestine consider Jerusalem to be a part that cannot be taken away from Palestine.
وفي القدس المسجد الأقصى المبارك.
In Jerusalem there is Al-Aqsa Mosque.
هو مسرى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم.
It is where the Prophet ascended to the heavens.
ومعراجه إلى السماء الأولى.
And then ascended to the. It is where the Prophet traveled and then ascended to the heavens.
Okay.
وفي هذا يعني آية في القرآن الكريم سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى الذي باركنا حوله.
And there is a verse in the Quran that I will add later.
فنحن نعتبر المسجد الأقصى آية من كتاب الله.
So we consider Al-Aqsa Mosque to be one of God's miracles and mentioned in the Quran.
Okay, but before this, there was a Jewish temple there.
لكن قبل قبة الصخرة ومسجد الأقصى كان في هناك الهيكل.
بالنسبة لنا الحقائق التاريخية لا تغير ولا تبدل من الحقائق الشرعية.
To us, the historic facts do not change the present facts, the legal facts that exist now.
Does he recognize that? Does he know, or does he recognize that there was the Jewish temple there?
هل حضرتك بتعرف أو بتعترف إنه كان في هيكل هناك يوم من الأيام؟
والله أنا أعترف أن الأقصى آية من كتاب الله وأن الله عز وجل كما يعني يحفظ آياته في كتابه يحفظ المسجد الأقصى.
I consider that since Al-Aqsa is one of God's verses and one of God's creations, since God has taken care of and protected the Quran from any change, God will do the same for Al-Aqsa Mosque.
هو صحيح أن يعني صحيح يجب يعني أن نعرف ما حصل في الماضي، ولكن ما حصل في الماضي مهم، ولكن الذي سيحصل في المستقبل أهم.
It is true that knowing and the things that happened in the past are important, but knowing and doing things for the future is even more important.
فالقادم المستقبل إن شاء الله، المستقبل لهذه الأرض أنها كما بشر الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم أنها ستعود وتكون عاصمة لدولة الخلافة الإسلامية القادمة.
The future that is coming and what is more important is that, as the Prophet, peace be upon him, has told us, that Jerusalem will be the capital of the Caliphate state.
هذا وعد من الله وبشرى من
This is a
رسول الله.
promise from God, and this is good news from the Prophet, peace be upon him.
والمسلمون يعملون لذلك.
And the Muslims are working towards this.
وندعو جميع من يشاهدنا الدخول بالإسلام.
إن شاء الله ندعو الجميع إن شاء الله لمشاركتنا بهذا الخير.
And man on the right said, we ask everyone who watches this message to come into Islam, and man on the left said, we ask everyone who watches this message to do well and to do good.
يعني الشيخ توسم فيكم الخير كثيرا ويدعوكم إن شاء الله إلى الإسلام واعتناق العقيدة الإسلامية.
The Sheikh here is hoping that you will convert into Islam.
If you want me to ask more questions to Israelis and Palestinians, I need to be able to get to Israelis and Palestinians, and the way to do that is for you to contribute to the project, to pay my translator to get to Hebron and Bethlehem and Haifa and Beersheba. Please consider contributing to the project. It's the only way I can do this.
Thank you.
Christians around the world and many non-Christians are outraged because the Republic of Turkey has announced that Hagia Sophia will once again be converted into a mosque. Christians are angry. Christians are upset. But not me. I always look on the bright side. I focus on the positive, not on the negative. When life throws Islam at me, I make myself a nice tall glass of Islaminade. In this video, I'm going to explain why the reconversion of Hagia Sophia into a mosque isn't as bad as you might think. But first, since many viewers may not know much about Hagia Sophia or its significance in Christian history, here's a quick review of the current conflict. The Church of Hagia Sophia was built between 532 and 537 AD, although various structures had to be modified over time. Construction was ordered by the Roman Emperor Justinian I. It was built in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a city named after Constantine the Great. For many centuries, Hagia Sophia was the largest cathedral in the world, and for a while it had more interior space than any other building on the planet. There were numerous mosaics depicting Jesus and Mary and other figures in the church, and a vast array of Christian relics were housed there. Hagia Sophia was the seat of the Archbishop of Constantinople, the spiritual leader of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and it was the main house of worship for Eastern Orthodox Christians until Constantinople was conquered by Muslims in 1453. While the city was under siege, women, children, the sick, the elderly, and the wounded took refuge in Hagia Sophia. Once the Muslims captured the city, they battered down the door of the church, killed many of the sick, elderly, and wounded, took the women as sex slaves, and enslaved the children. The church was converted into a mosque, the relics were destroyed, the mosaics were either destroyed or plastered over, and minarets were eventually added. Hagia Sophia was a mosque until 1931, when it was shut down by the secular Turkish government. The Republic of Turkey uncovered the Christian mosaics and reopened Hagia Sophia as a museum in 1935. It was a museum for 85 years until Turkish President Erdogan announced that Hagia Sophia was once again a mosque. Naturally, Muslims gathered outside and began shouting, Allahu Akbar.
Tonight, some of his supporters took to the streets to celebrate the verdict. But the fear now is that the decision will sow the seeds of acrimony between Christians and Muslims, with the conversion of a magnificent unifying symbol into a potentially divisive one.
Am I upset? Not one bit. Look on the bright side. Muslims will never again be able to pretend that they respect other religions. Muslims will never again get to complain that we're disrespecting their religion or their book or their prophet. Think about it. Islam's holiest sites were taken from other religions. The Kaaba was a pagan shrine surrounded by pagan idols. Muslims conquered Mecca, smashed the idols to pieces, and made it the heart of Islamic worship. The heart of Jewish worship for 3,000 years has been the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. After conquering the city, Muslims built the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Jews have to pray at a nearby wall. For centuries, the heart of the Christian world was Constantinople, and the heart of Christian worship was Hagia Sophia, one of the most spectacular buildings ever constructed. The building was dedicated to the holy wisdom of God. But holy wisdom of God here isn't referring to God's wisdom in some generic sense. In 1 Corinthians 1:24, the Apostle Paul calls Jesus the power of God and the wisdom of God. They named the church Hagia Sophia in honor of Jesus, the wisdom of God. Muslims conquered the city and converted the church into a mosque. And now they've converted it into a mosque once again. So Muslims pray and worship at places that were centers of worship for Christians, Jews, and pagans. They treated Hindus the same way. Muslims constantly demand respect for their religion when they offer no respect in return. Every Islamic prayer in Hagia Sophia is a slap in the face to Christians. Every Islamic prayer in the Al-Aqsa Mosque is a slap in the face to Jews. To you Muslims who are watching, I'll say this. After 14 centuries of seizing other people's places of worship while shouting Allahu Akbar, you have lost the right to demand respect for your religion. Don't come complaining to me next month when season 2 of Muhammad's Boom Boom Room starts. Don't complain to me about how the Jews took your land when the land you pray on was taken from Christians and Hindus and every other group your armies encountered while trying to conquer the world. Your places of worship are monuments to your colossal hypocrisy. Thank you for reminding us of that yet again. We won't forget this time. As for everyone else who's watching, if you're upset that a museum that was once the main Christian church in the world has been converted yet again into a mosque, I encourage you to use that energy in a positive way. Here are some videos to share. When Muslims complain that you're hurting their feelings by sharing these videos, remind them about Hagia Sophia and give them a quick introduction to the concept of consistency.